Good evening. So I want to do something a little weird to start with for my own information. So I'm going to ask you to do something here. It's really simple. I want you to think about this Menzan text. Some of you have more of a relationship with it than others. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and show me on a scale of nothing to 5 how difficult this text seems to you as a Buddhist teaching text. So if you feel like I don't have much relationship with it yet, so I can't really answer the question, then do no fingers. If you think it's like the easiest thing you've ever read in the Buddhist teachings, that's 1. If you think it's like the hardest thing you've ever read, that's a 5. Does that make sense? So this is like, I'm not really sure. 1 is like super easy. 2 is like, oh yeah. 3 is like, oh, it's right in the middle there. 4 is like, oh, kind of challenging. 5 is like hard. Okay, so close your eyes and then show me your fingers real quick. Great, okay, thank you. That's good information for me. Because sometimes I don't know. And I keep talking about the same thing over and over, or at least it feels like that way to me. And I'm not sure if it's making sense or not, or how people are going with it. And when we did this text many, many years ago, it was one of the first that we did when we moved here in the first series of classes and things I was doing. For years after that, people would kind of joke about how the Menzan text was hard. So we have grown up a bit. It sounds like, oh, you guys, because you don't know what's your number. I would say it's landing a solid 3, which is one of the reasons you never give 5 as the number, because then people tend to pick 3 because it's right in the middle. But it's kind of convenient because you have 5 fingers. Yeah. So,
I just want to say, as one of the people that Albie was here years ago, that it's very. I'm trying to find the right word.
Yeah.
That's the difference between then and now.
Yeah.
I remember some things I came to then, but it seemed so much less dense and mysterious this time.
Yeah. I also remember last time we did it, we spent a long time, I don't know, a year or 8 months or something, and we went by paragraph by paragraph, and I did excruciating analysis of the characters and things like that. So that was probably also a little bit of it. We're doing a little bit different approach as well. So, and of course we're all way more enlightened. So
there you go.
Good. So this is the 6th class. We'll have this class and 2 more classes after that. Just a reminder, originally the schedule had 1 class after Thanksgiving, but due to some family things, shifted that around a bit and decided, actually didn't shift around, I just canceled it. So tonight we're going to look particularly at a section. Again, this is not titled with sections, but I added some sections. There is some kind of natural break. So this from page 26, there's this section which I've titled to myself the Samadhi of the Tathagata, or the Tathagata Samadhi. And so we're going to look at that this evening kind of more closely. But before that, I want to do just a little bit of review. And I want to come back to this thing that, talking about again and again, keep drawing a circle and talk about it as a mirror. It's really a symbol of mind in Zen. One of my colleagues, she said she gets asked to come and speak at the university where she lives. Oftentimes she lives in the Midwest, and people don't have a lot, she's a little town in the Midwest, and they don't have a lot of experience with Buddhism. And so people always ask the question, they kind of know Zen and they kind of know Vajrayana, Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism. So they always ask, what's the difference? And she has this really clever way of responding to that. She says when she goes, she always brings one book, which is of mandalas, and all kind of iconography of the Vajrayana school, which is really amazing, very complex. And then she brings another book, which is a collection of ensos, or circles that are drawn by kind of famous Zen teachers. And she just shows in the books and she says, these are the same, this is the same truth. You know, this is in Zen, this is Vajrayana. And she said it really, like, it kind of clicks for people. And I remembered it because I think it has a lot of, that approach has a lot of merit. But we are, after all, in Zen school. And so this circle, which gets used a lot, kind of a symbol of mind, but not mind as just like the thinking mind, but mind in terms of the cosmos itself. So within Buddhism in general, and particularly within Zen, there is the very core teaching that all of the Dharma Dhatu, or all of existence, I guess is not even quite the right word, all that is or could be or would be or will be or has been, is mind. And that core teaching means that when we're talking about mind, we're not just talking about like what we experience inside our head. We're talking about the very, maybe we could say, fabric of reality. So the teaching here is that this is whole. And there's a couple metaphors that we've used to talk about that. One, which actually comes up later in the text, but I put out right from the very beginning, was this image of the persimmon. So particularly the astringent persimmon, the beautiful persimmons that are hanging on the tree out here in front of the abbot's office now, those are sweet persimmons. And so those, if they're green, they're a little bit astringent, but basically as soon as they're nice and in orange, they're sweet. But those are all like human horticulture. You actually can't grow a sweet persimmon you can't just grow a sweet persimmon tree. They're all grafts. Mm-hmm. So you have to take a persimmon stalk and then you graft on the sweet ones that were, I don't know who figured it out. I don't understand that stuff very well, but that's how you have to get the sweet one. The persimmon in its natural state, very, very astringent, and they're kind of elongated. They're also very beautiful, and the squirrels don't like to eat them, which means they hang around for a little bit longer than the sweet ones. But this becomes a symbol for this kind of wholeness, that the astringency of the persimmon is the very thing that leads to the sweetness of the persimmon, and that if you tried to extract the astringency, you would never know the sweetness. So this is kind of metaphor or symbol for mind, and that has a lot of implications for how we think about practice. And then the one that we've been working with a lot is the metaphor of the mirror. So that it's a mirror that really has no edge. That's one of the reasons we use a circle, is because that becomes a symbol of like we're pointing to something, but we couldn't define it or say where it is or isn't. And that edgeless mirror is reflecting everything. So on page 24, in this last section, in the first full paragraph, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth line from the top at the very end, he says this pivotal thing, which he's getting back to again and again and again. But here he just clearly states, there is no original mind separate from arising mind. So if we go to the mirror metaphor, that the mirror itself is usually symbolized in this metaphor as mind. The mirror itself is mind, and then there are all these images that arise in mind. And he's making this point that once we start thinking that way, which is very natural within Buddhism of all the teachings, we naturally give rise to a certain kind of mistake, which is to think there's an arising mind which is separate from the arising mind, or primary to the arising mind, or if we could get rid of the arising mind, there would just be the original mind. And he's saying, no, there's no original mind that's separate from the arising mind. Whatever is arising in mind is not to be discarded. It's not something that we can get out of the everythingness. There's no place to put it. There's no outside, right? The reason I'm emphasizing this is, remember the teaching here is Jijuyu-zanmai, was the self receiving and employing samadhi. That self has no other. That's the core teaching of that self. It's not a self as opposed to other. It's the all-inclusive body of light of Vairochana Buddha. That's the first thing we started with in that introduction. The Vairochana Buddha has these two aspects, which is the body of light, which is totally self-inclusive, which includes all things, and then the one which is completely shining and illuminating all objects. And he says in that introduction that that's not just Vairochana Buddha, we're that too, right? And that's a difference of the Zen school. Right? The Zen school says that everybody's mind and heart is exactly the same as Vairochana's, and you don't have to wait around for that. That's the capacity and functioning of our own heart. Right? So here he says it really clearly, and then down when he's discussing the Mu koan. So this is probably the most famous koan after What's the Sound of One Hand Clapping, which isn't really a koan that people get very much apparently. But this actually, if you were to study in a modern day Rinzai tradition, this will almost for sure be the first koan that you were given. Almost everyone's on Mu. And depending on who the teacher is, you could stay there from anyway to one retreat to 20 years. Like a Sogenji Harada Roshi, who's many of you know of him. Chozen and Hogen Beis Roshi both studied with him quite a bit, and he has a dojo up in Whidbey Island and comes sometimes and teaches there. So probably the strongest Rinzai effect in the Northwest would come from him. And he's famous for like people stay on Mu for like ever. And he says, if you could actually pass Mu, you should be able to pass every other koan. So if you really understood Mu, if you really could give the correct response to Mu, then everything else should just be like the same gate as Mu. Anyway, the only reason I say that is because this is like poster child of koans. It's also proof that Menzan is not anti-koan, which I said earlier, even though he says people got confused because they started looking at the phrases of koans, and I was explaining that's a very particular way of using koans, which he dismisses. It's the way Harada Roshi uses koans. So they would probably have a fight if they were trying to. Actually, they probably wouldn't have a fight. They probably would be so obstinate. Both of them would be so obstinate there would be no fighting possible. So, does a dog have Buddha nature? Mu, which conventionally is a negation. So sometimes gets translated as no, but oftentimes gets just transliterated as mu, because it's not enough to just think of it as no. And then the monk said, it is said that all sentient beings have Buddha nature. Why does a dog not have Buddha nature? And Joshu says, it is because a dog has karmic nature. Okay, so that's the full koan. Now this next paragraph, which I don't want to spend too much time on because we could spend a whole class kind of wrestling with this, but I want to point to it because it's really important what he's saying here. Because this thing which I can say, look, delusion and awakening are all interpenetrated here, don't divide them out. He starts to get into the implications in this a little bit. You can just accept that because I've repeated it 578,000 times, even in just 5 classes. So you start going, yeah, that sounds true. I've heard that before. but now when we get into the implications, things get freaky, okay? So that's a place where the challenging part gets out. So let's just look at that real quick. That's that last paragraph on page 24 that starts in the case of a dog. So he's in the case of a dog, body, mind, and the whole world is the realm of the dog's karmic nature. So there is nothing extra such as Buddha nature. Right? So in the realm of the arising mind, okay, of the deluded mind, of all of the multiplicity that appears in the world of dog, it's dog all the way through. It's all dog. Every appearance is dog. And he says, that's the dog's nature, the karmic nature of a dog. You don't try to squeeze in some Buddha nature. Just accept that it's totally dog. Right? Now the reason that's important is because once you try to squeeze in Buddha nature, you're trying to relate 2 reflections within the mirror. You're trying to reflect this circle inside here, which you've called Buddha, and the one you've called dog, and you're kind of comparing them to each other. Or maybe you say the whole thing, it's too bad that, Oh, I don't know how you draw a dog.
Not like that.
You know, that's his eye.
Dinosaur.
Hey.
Even more of a dinosaur.
A humpback dog. So the dog fills up the whole thing, and then you just want to get, you're like, but yeah, everybody should be saved, so let me squeeze in my little Buddha here, like that. So he's saying, no, mistake. Dog fills up the whole thing, this whole thing. And that's if you think about the human nature, the way that we see the world, everything we experience through the human lens, etc. He's saying that that's not something to fight against and try to squeeze in this Buddha nature. This is why Joshu says mu. Now, if you go to the next part, he says, in the case of the Tathagata, this karmic nature is referred to as Buddha nature because the karma of a Buddha is the completeness of awakening. And so it's referred to as the Buddha, or it's referred to as Buddha nature. But then he goes on to say, that is why when we look from the deluded point of discrimination limited by illusory mind, even the Tathagata's life with perfect virtue seems nothing but a part of a transmigration, the cycle of life and death. Right? So even the completeness of the Tathagata's unmoving, brilliant mind, from the perspective of human being, looks like he was born into the world and then he died. It looks like transmigration. It looks like this kind of process, because that's what we see. Because that's what an arising mind would see. It says, on the other hand, when we are illuminated by Buddha's wisdom, all sentient beings in the 6 realms of transmigration are the eternal Dharma body of the Tathagata. So now he turns it around. He says, but if you take up the Buddha mind, or you receive the Buddha wisdom mind, then all of those things that look like they're transmigrating, just like the Tathagata looks like it's transmigrating, like the dog, for example, is Vairochana Buddha's mind. There's no hindrance. They're no longer like a little piece of something that you call deluded because you're comparing it to something that you call awakened. That the awakened mind of Buddha doesn't stand in the way of any of those individual things. In this sense, delusion and awareness are one. Life and death and nirvana are not separate. Dogen Zenji also said there is no kyakujin, which means dust that's apart from ourselves, in the whole universe. There is no second person right here. And this last line, this is a kind of stock phrase of Zen. There's no second person right here. He's saying there's not like 2 things in here. There's only one mind. So we shouldn't divide it that way. This is why the question of Buddha nature is so tricky, because a conventional Mahayana way of talking about Buddha nature is just to say all beings have Buddha nature. And that's not quite right, because then you'll say like, okay, here's a being, and then inside the being there's this Buddha nature. And you're like, if we could just get rid of the being, then there would be the Buddha nature would be left. And that sets up all kinds of problematic ways of thinking about ourselves and other beings and what's worthy or not worthy of our care and affection, etc. So if you're interested in that exploration, Dogen Zenji's very challenging fascicle called Buddha Nature is a really good place to look into that, and he'll turn your mind inside out. So the reason that I wanted to bring that up is because I just wanted to show that this simple circle has a lot of, it kind of will mess with our normal ways of thinking about things. And that's important because the more simple explanation can catch us really easily. And then we can kind of live in a certain sort of dogma related with it. So that's why the monk was so surprised, right? He's like, does a dog have Buddha nature? Of course he's expecting to say, yes, even a dog has Buddha nature. But no, Joshu's like, no. Right? Not so easy. It's not kumbaya, right? It's not like everybody get together, let's feel all right. The dog actually is a dog. People are much more fond of dogs than they were in Joshu's time. So now we're like, oh yeah, but it's all dog, we love dogs. But at that time it would have been like outside rover. So that's important for us to see that the simple explanation is going to get us in trouble. And what I've been encouraging is why the explanation is helpful, why Menzan goes about doing it, why we're spending any time thinking about it and talking about it, is to try to reorganize some of the patterns of our thinking to help us more clearly look into the well, which I've been talking about that, the poem of the well, that the moon is shining in and the donkey is looking in. The donkey is the symbol of ignorance or delusion, and the moon is awakening, and there it's shining in that deep well of consciousness, which is also the mirror. That we actually have to look in, and that's our job. That's why zazen is put at the front, because zazen is the practice of that looking. And if we get stuck on the explanation, then we get in trouble. That's also why we do this for 1 hour a week, right? And most of the week, all the time, we're not doing this discursive thinking. We're just practicing this looking into the well. So he calls this looking into the well, emitting the light beyond thought. Right? And that's on kind of in the middle of the page on 26. And I wanted to talk about this really quick because this term beyond thought, some of you would know as being part of the famous trifecta: thinking, not thinking, non-thinking. This also comes from a koan, and then is picked up by Dogen and used as a way to explain what is zazen. And so in the Fukan Zazengi, for example, which is this like very core text on the teachings of zazen by Dogen Zenji, he describes the essential art of zazen as thinking, not thinking, non-thinking. So here he uses this term, non-thinking. He says, emitting the light of non-thinking.
I had a question about this very thing last week.
Yeah.
So it goes, therefore, when our mind, if the light of beyond thought is emitted, so that word emitted kind of hung up on that.
Yeah.
So from where and how, and I don't know.
Yeah. It's an evocative word, emit, because it seems like there would be a subject which emits the light. Like, right. Okay, now I'm a flashlight, and if I got the ever-readies in there.
Or a place.
Or a place,
right.
Yeah, exactly. And so the characters in Chinese are, or the Chinese characters that's used in a Japanese context, is tenpatsu, which means like emitted from a place. Like ten is like a spot. And I don't know why they use that character, but we do have example within the Lotus Sutra, for example, where the emission of the light by the Buddha comes from the curl of hair here on his forehead.
Okay.
So there is something about the dot and the everything, which is what this light is working with.
Okay.
What is the? I hesitate to use the word relationship, but I'll use it here. What is the relationship between this dot and the everythingness?
Okay.
And so that emission of light, of non-thinking, is that's a kind of question we could ask there. I think one of the things that's interesting about this is not thinking and non-thinking both are negations of thinking. They're both ways to negate the word thinking, but they have a different kind of meaning. And people go on and on about trying to figure out what this is. There was just a long, I don't know how many 100 emails on one of the Zen teacher listservs that I belong to. And I got so frustrated. And I was going to write something, but I never did because I don't really write emails. Many of you know that. But because people were really reifying non-thinking. By reify, I mean they were kind of saying, well, non-thinking is like this, and non-thinking is the pinnacle of practice, and non-thinking is when you're like in this state and everything. And I was just going, no! Because I was always taught about this and believe the better way to think about it is like a triangle. So if you want to talk about these things, it's better to think you've got thinking, not thinking, and non-thinking. And if you talk about any one of them, you're talking about the other two. It's just that one has come into the forward. And that's how we get intimate with our mind, is not try to think that non-thinking is the goal of Zen practice, but to realize that all of them are functioning together. So that when you think not thinking, that's called non-thinking. Okay? When you non-think not thinking, that's called thinking. When you non-think thinking, that's called not thinking. Anyway, you could play with that when you're bored in zazen. See where it goes. But this light of non-thinking, he refers to it. He refers to it as light, and he says that this is what will melt the delusory mind. Right? This is the thing which allows us to not just be transfixed in the arising mind. If we go back to the mirror metaphor, to not just be transfixed in the images that are there, but that the total intermingling of the images and the light is now possible, but it's ungraspable. And this is the really important thing. And this is what he goes into on the page of bottom of page 26, which is now where he's going to focus on the samadhi of the Tathagata. What is the quality of the samadhi of Buddha, and why does that matter to us? So right here at the bottom of page 26, in this first part, he spends a couple pages here talking about Tojiyo-zanmai, Zanmayo-zanmai, and Muryo-gisho-zanmai, which are three ways to talk about the samadhi of the Buddha that come from famous sutras. And the first one, Tojiyo-zanmai, and the second one, Zanmayo-zanmai, both come from the Perfection of Wisdom sutras. And mostly people here, you'll be familiar with the Perfection of Wisdom sutras through the Heart Sutra, because we chant that really, really often. That's the most commonly chanted Prajnaparamita Sutra. Prajnaparamita Sutras, there's a whole bunch of them. And that's like the most kind of concise. It's not narrative at all. And in Prajnaparamita Sutras in general are not very narrative. There's parts of them that are narrative. They don't tell us so many stories. Like, it's not like, one day the Buddha went to blah, 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 and da, 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 da. There's a little bit of that, but mostly it's more like teachings. The Diamond Sutra, many of you will have studied that, because we study that here a lot. But those are both very, very short. When he's referring to the Zanmayo-zanmai and the Tojiyo-zanmai, he's talking about something which is referred to in the large Perfection of Wisdom sutras. This is a fifth of the size of the large Perfection of, and this one has, 665 pages of print that kind of looks like this in the English. So you probably, it's probably like, the large one is several thousand pages, 4,000 pages of this kind of print. That's the long version of the Prajnaparamita. That's the one that we fan at New Year's. And we only have 60 volumes that it's in, but if you open those and look inside, the print is like tiny, 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 tiny. Usually it comes in 600 volumes. But we have the appropriately sized version for our temple and community. So that is where that comes from. So when he's referring to that, he's not just being like, oh yeah, there's this thing called Zanmayo-zanmai. He's talking about basically what has created the Mahayana, like this body of work, which is the foundation of thousands of years of lifetimes, poured into this thing, and is studied very, very diligently. Mostly it's studied in shorter forms. So the most famous scholar, teacher of the Prajnaparamita literature was named Nagarjuna. He mostly wrote commentary on this the large sutra on perfect wisdom. This is Kanza's translation. This is the Prajnaparamita in 20,000 lines. So mostly Nagarjuna was working from this one. So this also has interesting stuff. I won't go into it for too long. I'm so geeked out about this stuff, so I could just talk about it forever. But there's this particular section in this that I really like, which is called The Equipment with Merit. And it's about concentration. And there's 112 different names for concentration, the concentration of the Tathagata. And so, it starts out with a concentration called heroic valor. Through that concentration, the range of all the concentrations is experienced. And then if I just pick some things out at random through it, it might be the moon as glorious ensign. The concentration carries the ensign of all concentrations as a token of victory. Or the concentrated called the mode of the doer. One brings about this work and performance of all concentrations. Or the accurate definer. One can delimitate all dharmas and concentrations. Anyway, these are all names of the concentration. And one way is to think about them as different concentrations, which is the way it's oftentimes talked about, but they're also all one concentration. Every concentration basically is referring to the wholeness of concentration, right? Like a different way to understand what the concentration is, or a different aspect of it. So again, it comes back to this, that there is a concentration. In this case, Menzan is referring to it as the samadhi king of samadhis. The samadhi king of samadhis. And that's how the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras refer to it. And it is all inclusive of all of those samadhis. Now, in the Lotus Sutra, has a little bit different feel, where the Prajnaparamita Sutras have this kind of like the king is at the center and all things are illuminated kind of quality. The Lotus Sutra does something a little bit different, where the Buddha's here in the west, and then the light shines from the Buddha's curl of hair on the forehead and illuminates the eastern quarter, which then later is referred to as illuminating all the worlds. So it's a very interesting change in language. So the Buddha is more relational. Like there's a Buddha and then there's all the world and they're meeting each other. Whereas the Zanmai, or the Samadhi king of samadhis, feels more like a circle with the Buddha at the center. Right? So I like to think about those differences. I think they're really important. I think the Zanmai, or the Samadhi king of samadhis, has some weaknesses that the Lotus Sutra reveals. And the other way is probably true too, but I'm kind of partial to the Lotus Sutra right now, so I don't know about the other direction so much. So in the Lotus Sutra, that's a really important part to pay attention to, that it's not, there's all kinds of stories. The Lotus Sutra is the opposite of the Prajnaparamita, and the Lotus Sutra is all narrative. It's all stories. And then stories within stories. And then stories within the stories within the stories. So in that text, this illumination is also there. Now, I think he chooses these two because they're the very most kind of famous ones, but I think you could also consider that it's a big range of type of teaching, everywhere from the Prajnaparamita teaching to the Lotus Sutra, everywhere from, on art altar, from Prajnaparamita on Buddha's left to Avalokitesvara on Buddha's right, which is one of the main chapters of the Lotus Sutra. In that whole spread, we have this samadhi, okay? That the illumination of this samadhi is all the way through those things. And that in both of those sutras, the light of that samadhi releases the suffering of all beings. And there's this, long explanation, the descriptions of all the beings and how it is that they're released from their particular suffering. Yeah.
I think I'm getting a little bit lost with samadhi. So what I understand to be meditation or posture. And so I'm wondering, what's the illuminating nature, or what exactly is being described here?
Yeah, so in the sutras, it describes that the Buddha will enter samadhi. So in the Lotus Sutra, for example, the Buddha enters the samadhi of innumerable meanings. And upon entering the samadhi of innumerable meanings, then the eastern quarter is illuminated from the light that shines from the tuft of hair in the Buddha's forehead. So the teaching in that is that the samadhi it goes back to the introduction to this text that we're looking at, that the samadhi both has a total self-illumination quality and it has an other illumination quality. So when we think about the self-illumination quality, is just the Buddha sitting in total oneness, we could say. But then that also is an illumination. It's a total self-illumination. In the text at the beginning, or partway through, it says it's like a jewel which illuminates itself. Right? It's just a jewel refracting its own light endlessly. But then from the other perspective, that's illuminating all the worlds. And every being is illuminated by that light, and that has a real implication for the lives of all of those beings which are illuminated. So when we talk about concentration or samadhi, we tend to talk about it in a very narrow and functional way. And that's part of what Menzan is it's one of the reasons I want to teach this text, because I think that we get too nuts and boltsy about meditation, and we think that we're doing this thing which we can kind of understand and measure in terms of like my conventional understanding of what concentration is and what I think it should look like, and whether I'm doing it or not doing it, and all those kinds of things. And Menzan's challenging us to see that there's another way to approach it, which isn't so nuts and boltsy or yardsticky, like trying to measure what I'm doing. So the samadhi of innumerable meanings and the samadhi king of samadhis, then he says, this is the zazen we practice today, right? Which is a radical thing to say. Almost all of the schools will say these are all teachings about Buddhas, and you're a sentient being, and your job is to create enough good karma that you will be reborn in a favorable way, and you'll practice hard, and maybe you'll rely on the saving power of a Buddha that's created a pure land like Amida Buddha, and then over innumerable kalpas, then you will have the capacity of Buddhahood. And everyone has it, but it's going to be bajillions and bajillions and bajillions of bajillions. Not just bajillions and bajillions, but bajillions of eons. Before you would reach that Buddhahood. And here he's saying, no, this is our practice. If we talk about it as it's a practice of a Buddha. And so our practice is to practice Buddha, not to practice to become a Buddha. You see the difference? Not to practice to say, how do we get the dog out and the Buddha in, but to say, even when it's all dog, there is still the practice of Buddha. Which is not just possible, but has been entrusted to us, and that's what it is that our practice is about. But that the deal with it is it's ungraspable. Okay, it cannot be grasped by discursive thought. He says that over and over. And the famous lines from the Lotus Sutra become important here, where in the Lotus Sutra, it's giving the same teaching. And it says, only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fathom the reality of the whole Dharma. It's kind of a little bit of a loose translation. But only a Buddha together with a Buddha can fathom the reality of the whole Dharma. This is one of my favorite lines in the Lotus Sutra. And actually it says something even a little bit weirder than that. That's Okumura Roshi trying not to confuse people too much, but in the process of maybe confusing us more. Which is, it actually says, only a Buddha alone, together with a Buddha, can bow. And then it's the same from there. So this line, only a Buddha alone, this is the one that gets dropped in the translations a lot. So the first line sounds like only a Buddha in their total solitariness. Jijuyu-zanmai. Self-illuminating. But then goes on to say, together with a Buddha. So there is such thing as a Buddha that's totally alone, but is also together with Buddha. And that's a kind of turn of phrase. It's more like poetry. You can't, if your brain's reconciling it, you're just making up some bullshit to fit the two together, right? So it's not really reconcilable. So that's why that's its power. I mean, you can find an explanation to say, well, the second one's talking about this kind of Buddha, and the first one's talking about this kind of Buddha, blah, blah, blah. And that's what the scholars do. That's why Zen is always like sort of dismissing the scholars, because they come up with these complicated explanations. And you say, no, just to hold that paradox is really important. That there's this total aloneness of a Buddha, but then that Buddha is together with another Buddha, maybe the dog. And that's what he's emphasizing about the ungraspability of it. If we're going to peer into that well, we need to peer in through ungraspability. We're not peering into the well and then figuring out what the moon has. What is the moon? How could I describe it? How could I grasp it in some kind of discursive way? But it has something else to teach us, which is maybe sometimes I describe this as a open system. Our discursive thought tends towards a closed system. So we want to describe what's happening in terms of what we know now. And so we create a system of relationships based on the number of, we have 458 billion pieces on the board. And we try to link them all together to understand and explain what's happening. But this way of non-thinking is to say, oh yeah, 48 billion pieces on the board. Open system. Now there's 49 billion. Now there's 22. Now there's 1. And that system is not caught in the network of, or at least that's kind of a way that we could think about what he's encouraging us to do. And that is what zazen is. Yeah.
Is this only a Buddha alone together with another Buddha the same instance in the Lotus Sutra with the emergence of the massive stupa with an ancient Buddha inside it?
So that's the it's not right in the same place, but that's the implication. So then you have, this is really beautiful. This is I'm always tempted to convert to different schools of Buddhism and or other religions. I'm always just on the edge of becoming a Muslim or becoming Nichiren Buddhist or something. But that's the one that gets me with.
Can you say more about that? I wasn't quite following what he was asking.
So in the Lotus Sutra, in the setting, as the Buddha's preparing to teach the Lotus Sutra, which in the Lotus Sutra there's just this constant, the Buddha
Constant
getting
preparation
ready
to
teach the Lotus Sutra, and that is the Lotus Sutra. It's like the Lotus Sutra is the preparation for teaching the Lotus Sutra, and then there's a Buddha which appears in a massive stupa that's like bigger than the earth, but still rises out of the earth's ground and up into space, and in that stupa there's a Buddha, and that Buddha pledged before passing into final nirvana that whenever the Lotus Sutra was to be preached, that this Buddha would appear. And so then there's a whole scene where for this stupa to be opened, all of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and all of the cosmoses have to come together. That's the only way that the stupa can be opened. And that's the only way to verify that it's truly the Lotus Sutra is kind of the implication of that. And so then there's this calling together of all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. They all come, the Buddhas with their attendants, and they all sit under a jeweled tree, which is identical to the tree that the Buddha Shakyamuni awakened under. And there's a whole blah, 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 blah. And they come up and then they open it. And then the Buddha Shakyamuni sits with the abundant treasures Buddha.
Okay.
And so there's a Buddha and a Buddha. So if you're at a very Lotus Sutra focused school of Buddhism, like Nichiren school in particular, all of the schools that flow out of Nichiren, there's not one Buddha on the altar, there's 2. And they oftentimes are in a kind of stupa. And that's very beautiful and big challenge to our mono mind. because we have a big delusive drive that wants to reduce things to a single unitary thing, which has some, power and some purpose, but also I think has some unskillful qualities to it too. So I quite like that, and so this isn't right. It's not like then right there in the story, but it's part of the whole package. Yeah. Okay, so then this part on page 30 gets nice and juicy. Actually, it's page 29, sorry. And he's saying, okay, most of the way we've been talking about all of this is spatially oriented. So we're talking about a mirror, we're talking about reflections in the mirror, we're talking about relationality, or we're talking about how non-relationality, but we're not talking time, right? We're talking like different things. We're talking a Buddha and a Buddha. But there's no reference to where they exist in time. And now he's going to take up this same teaching, but he's going to take it up through time. And whenever, those of you who studied the Genjo Koan together last fall in this lecture series, if you remember the firewood and ash debacle, which is was the Genjo Koan. That's this part that's just like, you're like, yeah, I'm one moon in every drop of water and I'm totally with it. And then he starts talking about firewood and ash and you're just like, what's he talking about? But that's what happens when we move from space to time. We're used to dealing with difference in space in a kind of like a spacious way. But when it's time, because in our delusion, time becomes linear, one directional, and we experience it as a successive moments of experience, which is diluted, by the way. That gives us a sense of time where we're like trapped in a way that we don't feel quite the same way in space. So it's really important to pay attention to the places where the time teachings come up, because they challenge us in a different way and they have ability to open something up. And I would also say many of our biggest challenges have to do with time. I mean, the most obvious one being loss. That whether that's our own loss of people that we love or things that we care about, or loss of our own life, that's all bound in time in a way that, as far as we can see, is pretty irreversible. And so this keys into something. Yeah.
So I'm thinking this is the reason why you like the narrative form of the Lotus Sutra. And also there's a weirdness that the kind of more mandalic vision of samadhi in the Prajnaparamita Sutras it is aligned with something that doesn't have narrative, doesn't have a temporal quality. But then when you talk about samadhi in the Lotus Sutra, where you have a narrative quality, then the light moves through space.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have cool things like the Buddha being like part of the Lotus Sutra. The ground opens up and these bajillions of bodhisattvas come out and fill up all the space, which is so cool. And then they're like, oh, who are these bodhisattvas? And the Buddha Shakyamuni says, oh, they're my students. Right after saying, they've been in the earth for countless eons. And then they're like, how can they be your students? You're like, 72. And these guys are like ancient. So how could you be? And then that's when he preaches the verse of the lifespan, which is, oh, you've misunderstood who I am. You think I am this kind of being that comes and goes, and I am a being that comes and goes, but I'm also a being that doesn't come and go. And so all of those ways that time gets worked with in the Lotus Sutra, because narrative is present, is really different. And I think that's a quality of the wisdom teachings where everything is just laid open. Time, space, everything. And there's such a strength and beauty to that. But it also can fail to touch certain parts of us, or we have a hard time letting it touch certain parts of us. And so the compassionate side is really important, equally as important. And so let's look at this paragraph because this is pretty kind of, I don't know if technical is the right word. So there's again the last paragraph on the page 29 that starts with furthermore. He says, furthermore, our practice enlightenment of this samadhi is in the stage of cause, while the Tathagata's dwelling in this samadhi is in the stage of effect. Within the stage of cause, we actualize the effect, and within the stage of effect, the Tathagatas complete the cause. Therefore, cause and effect are not two, and are beyond the argument of whether they are the same or different. They are beyond thought and discrimination. And then he goes on to talk a little bit more about that. So this goes to very foundational Buddhist teaching of cause and effect, which the Buddha always, Buddhist teachings always emphasize this. But it gets pretty thorny, and there's big debates about it. So, sorry. So this is how cause and effect. The other thing that's really important is cause and conditions. This one is N. So a lot of you know this when we talk about N, karmic conditions. So the basic teaching is that, gosh, that's really, that if we want to understand how things are functioning in understanding causes and conditions, that a cause is like a seed, right? And a seed will bear a fruit. This character, in fact, it means something like fruit, or is used to mean something like fruit. So the seed will create a fruit, but the fruit only will be created if it's within the right conditions. So we have a cause, but the cause could lay, not necessarily dormant isn't the right word, but it could not fully express its effect until the conditions are right. Mm-hmm.
And is this all the in and the n?
Yep, exactly. In and n. Mm-hmm. So the in would often be called the visible, and the n would be the not visible. So the in is like you can see, the cause is like this thing you can see, this is the reason for it, but then all the things that support it. So the seed is like the cause, but then all the things that are not the seed are the conditions which allow the seed to come to maturation.
So this is akin to the storehouse consciousness.
Yeah, so this is used within the Yogacara,
as
strongly used in the Yogacara to explain how things function, so that all of these causes are seeds that get planted into deep mind, like that mirror at the bottom of the well. And then when the conditions are ripe, they find their expression in a life. So that's one of the places it's used a lot. So in this, he's not talking about conditions, but he's talking about cause and effect. Cause and conditions is a spatial relationship. Cause and effect is a time relationship. And he's saying that in practice awakening, or I think in the translation here it's practice enlightenment, which is Dogen's term for what we do. He doesn't say we practice to become enlightened, right? Or we don't practice and then become enlightened, but we practice enlightenment. We practice the luminosity of the Buddha through zazen, right? We're not waiting for anything. And as we do that, we could identify that the practice enlightenment of that samadhi is in the stage of cause. Okay? And the Tathagata's dwelling in. Notice he doesn't say the Tathagata's practice enlightenment of. He says the Tathagata's dwelling in this samadhi is the stage of effect. Okay? So he's comparing now in the same way before he was comparing sentient beings and Buddhas, right? In space. Now he's comparing the practitioner of this samadhi now, or in the stage of cause and the stage of effect, rather than now and later. Okay? He's not just talking about now and later. He's saying we dwell completely in the stage of cause, and the Tathagata dwells completely in the stage of effect. Because of that, within the stage of cause, we actualize the effect. Right? So in this cause, we're not waiting for the effect. We are directly actualizing the effect. So another way to say that is that we're receiving the heart of the Tathagata, and we're employing that heart. And that's what it means to be in the stage of cause. Right? And that's sentient beings who are practicing the way are. But if we look at it from the Tathagata's perspective, we'd say within the stage of effect, the Tathagata completes the cause. So from the Tathagata's side, there is this completion of the cause. There's the wholeness of it that the Tathagata's illumination is about. There is this interpenetration between the sentient being and the Buddha. And so that's why we say the cause and effect are not two. And that cause and effect are beyond thought and discrimination. Now, going back to the Lotus Sutra again, I wasn't planning on talking about the Lotus Sutra so much tonight, but this is very important type of, again, sort of a philosophical explanation of why the Buddha can give predictions of Buddhahood. So there's one chapter of the Lotus Sutra in which the Buddha people come up and they're like venerating the Buddha, and the Buddha says, "Oh, nice to see you. You will be the Buddha of great illumination, as if it were great light from a keyhole in a dark room beside the sun. And this will happen in 40 billion kalpas, whatever it is." And then the person, "Oh, thank you very much." And then someone else will come up and he give them a prediction of Buddhahood. And this happens throughout the Lotus Sutra in different ways, but there's one particular chapter where it happens. And then Devadatta, who is like the sower of mischief and delusion in the Lotus Sutra, comes forward, and everyone's like, "Oh, well, no way." Yeah. And then the Buddha gives Devadatta a prediction of Buddhahood, which is super radical, and it's keys right into what Menzan's been saying all along here. That Devadatta's don't try to squeeze a Buddha into Devadatta, but don't try to squeeze Devadatta out of the Buddha. And that even Devadatta's is this kind of bad guy, is given a prediction of Buddhahood. Now, one way we can understand this is that this samadhi is the samadhi which allows the wholeness of the Buddha's samadhi. It's not really a prediction for the Buddha. It's just what the Buddha sees. The Buddha's not seeing into the future. The Buddha is just the illumination of the wholeness of time. And so there's no just like there's no here and there in that illumination, there's no before and after. The cause and effect is one. Cause and effect is whole. And that from one perspective, we see it playing out, but from another perspective, there just is the wholeness of it. Now, that's kind of very theological, philosophical, and that might click for you or not. But I know I mentioned this last year when we were studying Genjo Koan. When you come up against the limitations of a life, particularly mortality, this is a place where this teaching becomes really, really important. And you got to ask yourself, is a shorter life less worthy than a long life? Is a long life better than a short life? Are short people less important because they take up less space than a big person? Like our occupation our occupying of space, we can kind of admit is just, well, it's causes and conditions that are the shape of who you are and what you are. But when it comes to time, we have this kind of value judgment about the length of time, and that has a lot to do with our not being able to experience the wholeness of time. And in some traditions, like I remember reading about a Native American tradition a long time ago. I wish I had more detail about it. And in their cycles of coming of age, once you come through the full cycles of coming to age, I forget what, I think that was 16, then no one keeps track of their years after that. They only keep track of those first 16. And then after that, it's just, the cycle is just happening over and over again in big ways and little ways. And that's actually how our life is too. Like each moment's like a little circle, and then each day's like a circle, and each week's like a circle, and each month and year and lifetime and eon. And all of those circles in a way are the same circle. This is the kind of thing that Dogen teaches, and then Menzan is inviting us into. He's saying that that's the quality of the illumination. And that's why it's so important that, when you're sitting zazen, that you come against the wall of time. If you haven't done that yet, I would be surprised, because it usually takes exactly one period of zazen to come against that wall of time. And then you see like, oh, I'm addicted to this, and you're like, when's the bell gonna ring? Or oh, the bell rang already, or whatever it is. Everything's laid out in our discursive mind in time, even when we might feel a kind of spaciousness in space.
I think, we're completely used to thinking about the wholeness of time, but we think about it as space. So you picture like the classic, it's just a tapestry and we're ants on the tapestry walking through. So it's all, the narrative. But to do that, you have to imagine a space that you're outside of.
Right.
And so if there is no outside, if the mirror is edgeless, then that neat collation between space and time that allows us to imagine the wholeness of time, now it feels very...
Right. So what we oftentimes do is we trade the immediacy of the wholeness of time for a grand narrative of the wholeness of time. And in the grand narrative of the wholeness of time, that can provide a certain kind of comfort because we could know our place. There's a grand story in which we could say this is where we belong, even if that belonging there is painful. But the Buddhist teaching tends to be different. It says that actually there are infinite unfoldings of possibility and times. Infinite, usually we don't use that word in Buddhism so much, but there's unending, there's an unbounded possibilities and actualities of living, and that we don't, where there may be one particular trajectory of time which we're part of in at least one layer of our being, and we can pay attention to that and treasure it, and it's important. We don't want to get stuck in that because it's actually it's just kind of one way of looking at it, and that actually there's just many myriad ways that same thing is unfolding. I think this, for people who like to geek out on how does this compare with some kind of modern theoretical physics and those kinds of things, there's lots of correlations that happen there. I used to be more interested in that, and I became a little less interested in it because those are quite a particular grand narrative too. And I'm kind of more interested in the immediate experience or the immediate actuality of it, and that's where I think zazen is such a profound way of taking part in, rather than trying to understand it as a kind of a construct. But I'm not dissing anybody that tries to understand it as a construct. I think that's just cool too. That's also an instance of a way that things unfold and worthy of our attention, just a little bit less interesting to me these days. Yeah.
I think about that too, when we talk about that, what you were calling the grand narrative of the wholeness of time. It's a little bit like when we talk about oneness
Mhm.
and not two in a kind of universalist way.
Yeah.
And that when we're talking about it with time, the other side of that immediacy is like when we're talking about death and mortality and those kinds of things, is like when Uchiyama Roshi says, your whole world is born with you and then the whole world dies.
With you. Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
That's part of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Also.
Exactly. And it's kind of, I really hated that teaching when I first read it. Because I like people, and I just like people I love, and I don't want to be in a different world than them. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that it was my world was simply my world, I couldn't really accept that teaching. But then I started to see that it's not as a lonely thing. Maybe it's what makes real meeting possible. Mm-hmm. So then, if again in the Lotus Sutra, gosh, we may be just warming up for a Lotus Sutra class. One of the things that's great in those narratives is, like, for example, this abundant treasure Buddha, which appears. The way that the sutra tries to talk about who this Buddha is and where they come from never resorts to words like infinity, which are like these words which just trump everything, right? Mm-hmm. They just squish everything. Now we've got infinity, so we don't talk about anything, or it doesn't really talk about nothingness either, or zero. Those are kind of like ultimate words, and it's not that it couldn't use those words, but it doesn't. And so we get these explanations of this ancient time that is beyond comprehension, but still is located someplace in time. There's still a specificity to it, which makes abundant treasure Buddha not the overarching Buddha that controls everything, right? Now there's a meeting that happens between the Shakyamuni Buddha, which is the Buddha of our present world, and this other Buddha, which always shows up when the Lotus Sutra is going to be preached, even though he's totally in parinirvana, right? It's totally in complete nirvana, which means it shouldn't be showing up anywhere, but it actually shows up everywhere, but shows up where the Lotus Sutra is. Like those kind of things within the story become really meaningful, and that's why it refers to the samadhi as the samadhi of innumerable meanings. So in this case, meanings could also mean significance, or it could be like ways of receiving the teaching. So like in one part of the Lotus Sutra in the beginning, the Buddha says, I never convert any sentient being by a lesser means. If I did, that would be falling into greed. And that's something which a Buddha cannot do. And this is very important lines. He's saying that he's explaining what skillful means are. He was saying skillful means are not like, oh, I'm going to tell you a lie, but the truth is over here. Mm-hmm. He's saying there's no lesser mean. There's no lesser means. There's no lesser way. Every teaching is completely and exactly the same thing, because all the Buddha ever does is say one thing, and everyone hears it differently. Mm-hmm. There's that kind of teaching. So, in fact, the shortest version of the Prajnaparamita, I told you about the longest version. The shortest version of the Prajnaparamita is the Prajnaparamita in one syllable, which is just one syllable. Ah. And that's the whole sutra. Yeah. So hallelujah. Okay, next week we will. So he kind of turns a corner here after this. I think he's kind of made his case. He's kind of said the same thing over and over again in different ways and brought in different pieces. And then here, this next section, which I've titled The 3 Poisons and 3 Pure Precepts, is 31 to 35. And so we'll look at that, and then we'll also at least start into looking at the next section, which is 35 to 39, which I've called Body, Mind, and World Are One. And so he kind of goes, and he's making this big case for zazen. What is zazen? And now he's going to go in and do some more explaining about how this relates with all of these key key thing. Maybe that's the last thing I would say is this text can be helpful in different ways. And one way is to understand what Menzan is saying and try to understand the teaching that he's giving and why that's important. Another way that this text is helpful or important is that it connects a whole bunch of standard Buddhist teachings. So if you take a lot of these, I don't mean standard, I don't mean like kind of like the boring teachings. I mean like the central teachings of Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism. And Menzan has this really strong capacity to string them together on a single chord, and that's can be really helpful because you start seeing how they interrelate and why something's important. To talk about. Why is it important that the Buddha said there's no lesser skillful means, for example? You can start seeing how, in a way, there's always just talking about the same thing, but in a slightly different way. So there's that kind of roundness of understanding that comes from a eminent teacher like this that has this particular kind of mind. This is a little rare kind of mind for a Zen teacher. Zen teachers tend to be just like draw the circle or hit you with a stick or whatever. But this kind of more explanatory mind that draws a picture. It probably also is a mistake. But that wouldn't be the first or last. So.